Hello, everyone. We are very excited to have you join us today for yet another in the series of Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Services Third Thursday webinars. My name is Heather Hyman. I'm an attorney with Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, where I also manage our partnership with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. And I am here with my colleague, John, and our guest presenter, Candice, and we are very excited to have you joining us today to talk about a very interesting intersection of two topics: navigating tax controversies that are affecting human trafficking survivors. I'm going to hand it over to John real quick to introduce himself, and then we'll introduce you to our guest speaker and get rolling.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heather. So I'm John. I am the head of the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic at MVLS. So my side of operations covers all of the clients who come to us, sort of going through their income tax problems, whether it's with the Maryland Comptroller or the IRS, federal or state. And we provide them with, pro bono representation in regards to all those controversies. Excuse me. And I think I will now hand it over to Candice to introduce herself.
Well, Candice, I'll quick read your bio because we're so excited to have you here. Thank you again so much for joining us for this presentation. So Candice Miller is a tax attorney and a partner at Azarvand Tax Law, where she represents individuals and businesses in a variety of tax matters. Before joining Azarvand Tax Law, Candice was practicing as a tax attorney in a Maryland-based law firm and clerking for the Honorable Judge Kevin Arthur on Maryland's Intermediate Appellate Court. She received her JD from the University of Baltimore School of Law, shout out to Baltimore, graduating the top of her class. And her passion for law, actually, for tax law, began when she was a student attorney at University of Baltimore's Low Income Taxpayer Clinic. So we are just so excited to have you with us, Candice.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So you can see from our agenda today, we have a lot that we're going to be packing into this next hour. Just a few housekeeping notes before we dive in. This webinar is being recorded and you will be able to view it if you have to hop on, or for some reason, if someone wasn't able to make it. It's available at our MVLS library and also the library for the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. Available on both of our websites. We'll have information to link to those later. We also put up our PowerPoint slides there, so you'll be able to access the PowerPoints, take furious notes. You'll be able to get them later. And we are hoping there's going to be some discussion and questions. We'll be monitoring the chat. We ask that you use the chat for questions. If you want to use the Q&A, you can, but we prefer the chat to keep the conversation going. And you can see our agenda. We'll be doing a real quick overview of human trafficking. We do have a lot of anti-trafficking advocates who joined us for this session. So I'm not going to go too deep of a dive. If you're interested in learning more about our work in the anti-trafficking field and our work with our partnership with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, there's a ton of materials and information that you can access on our website. But then we're going to be diving into the tax issues, right? Looking at an overview of the tax controversy process, looking at some of the most common tax issues that impact human trafficking survivors, and really looking at how we can relieve the burden of tax liabilities and use a holistic practice model when tax practitioners are trying to work with survivors. So let's jump in.
All right. So to start off, I guess I'll just say a little bit about MVLS. We are currently, I believe, Maryland's largest pro bono legal services corporation. I believe we're pretty closely tied with Maryland Legal Aid. But so our mission is to remove barriers to justice through free civil legal help, community engagement, and advocacy for equitable laws. Our vision is for a fair legal system, free of injustice. It equitably serves underrepresented Marylanders. As part of that mission, MVLS has many different subject areas that we can represent our clients in. So not just tax and human trafficking prevention, but also criminal expungement, consumer liability, advanced planning and tangled title issues. And this gives us the opportunity through working with professionals in all these different fields to, as Heather said, really approach legal issues holistically for all of our clients to make sure that, when they're done working with MVLS, they haven't just solved one of the legal issues, they've solved all of them that they came to us with. And we do this through working with volunteers, professionals like all of you who take time out of their busy schedule to come provide this pro bono service to us and our clients. This mission that we're doing is so incredibly important, just on its own, but also because in the United States, the legal aid system just does not meet the needs of all of the people in the country. So right now, we believe just 20% of those in the country have their needs met. The remaining 8% of people, they're at a severe disadvantage in court. Our vision, as I mentioned before, fair legal system, we use this power of pro bono representation to try to bridge this power gap.
And we also do this, so we leverage our pro bono volunteers. We also leverage partnerships with a lot of different organizations in the community. And we've been lucky to be partnering with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project for almost a decade now. We do some deep dives into meeting the legal needs of individuals who not only have experienced sex and or labor trafficking, but individuals who have traded sex for any reason, by choice, out of circumstance, due to coercion. We really try to provide holistic legal services, as John said, doing a deep dive to meet any civil legal needs those individuals have that kind of fall under MVLS's purview. You can see that big list right there. And at the bottom in bold, we do assist with tax disputes. I will say, when clients come to us, often they aren't coming with tax needs. They're coming because they have a criminal record. They're coming because they're in severe debt. They're coming because they can't get an apartment or a job and they can't figure out why. And we're trying to help them unpack that with a legal lens. And often when we're doing that unpacking, we see, oh, look, there's a record of a judgment entered against you, and who's listed on that? The Maryland comptroller. Or we discover that they have some kind of dispute with the IRS, and we try to unpack how, why is this related to an experience of past exploitation. And that's when we need to call in colleagues like John, like Candice, to be able to assist with this work. We also, are a program that focuses on trafficking prevention, and we provide criminal record relief specifically, and then additional legal services to people who have experienced a combination of violence, trauma, other systemic inequities that put them at individuals at increased risk of exploitation. There's ways to reach out to us to get legal help. Our website that's specific to our anti-trafficking work is right there. And like I said, we're going to now switch to just a real quick dive into the anti-trafficking world, give some definitions just to set the table for any tax practitioners that might be here, that might be not so familiar with the terminology, with this space. For all of you that are anti-trafficking advocates working in this space, thanks for your patience, and we'll be getting to the complicated tax world shortly. All right, so what is human trafficking? There's so many ways to define this. As an attorney, I look to the law. I like to look to legal definitions. I like to, when I'm working with clients, not tell them that they are a human trafficking survivor, but that they have had experiences that meet the legal definition of human trafficking under either federal law or state law. And so I look for definitions at those different levels. It basically means that, someone is compelled into some kind of service or providing something across various labor sectors or in the kind of commercial sex industry. It's a vast kind of space. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. We try to be as kind of client-centered and client-led in all of our services as possible, let people define their own experiences. But if we go to the next slide, we'll look at actually some of the terms that we do use. So the basis for most anti-trafficking work in the US comes from federal law, from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was enacted in 2000. Most state laws are based on this federal law, which provides a definition for severe forms of trafficking in persons. And it breaks this into two categories: sex trafficking, which is defined as using force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, patronize, or solicit a person for a commercial sex act, or in which a person performing the act is under 18. So basically, if you are a minor, if you engage in a commercial sex act, there doesn't need to be this force, fraud, or coercion element. You are just considered to have experienced trafficking if you are engaging in a commercial sex act. Labor trafficking is a little bit different. There is, again, this using force, fraud, or coercion component, but there it's to recruit, harbor, transport, obtain a person for labor or services and involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. We see this across the agricultural sector. We see this in domestic work cases. We see this in so many different sectors, skilled nursing, restaurant workers, so many places. It's interesting because even though I think sex trafficking often gets a little bit more publicity and news coverage and attention, labor trafficking is generally agreed on by experts to be a more pervasive issue. It's interesting though, in Maryland, we actually didn't have a law against labor trafficking at the state level until just a couple of years ago. Well, we've had a law against sex trafficking on the books for a longer time. So this is just a basic overview. You can learn a lot more about these laws from some of the great anti-trafficking organizations that are out there ourselves. We have a lot of resources on our website. Polaris Project, Freedom Network. There's some great national resources out there. If you go to the next slide, one of the cruxes that we always look for, though, when I'm working with clients, if I'm trying to see if trafficking has occurred, is I look to see if there's been some element of force, fraud, or coercion that has, led to them engaging in a labor situation where they felt like they couldn't leave, or led to them engaging in a commercial sex act, right? So force is fairly easy to understand. You see the list right here: physical abuse, sexual abuse, isolation, confinement. I feel like the force part is what's often highlighted in like Hollywood movies, like Taken, or where someone's kidnapped, very sensational, right? Fraud is, say there's a situation where someone does a bait and switch. Someone's promised one thing and then the situation is turned on its head. We see this often in, say, like employment contracts or situations where someone might be traveling to work in a specific situation, and then that is absolutely not the situation they end up in. And then they're facing threats or facing uncertainty and circumstances that make it hard for them to leave. What I will say we see the most of the clients we work with is this third category of coercion. A situation where someone is facing, say, threats of harm to themselves, to their family, to other loved ones, emotional, psychological abuse. They are being kind of manipulated and having things withheld, like access to housing, clothing, food, drugs, any basic need, right? That's making them stay in a certain situation. And I will say, typically, many of the clients we work with, particularly in the Metro Baltimore area, are individuals who might have experienced challenges in their home life growing up, maybe grappling with substance use, housing instability, and then maybe ending up in situations of exploitation and being trafficked. And then after they're getting out of these situations, they're then trying to rebuild their lives in many different ways, get access to safe housing, try to find some more secure employment. And that's where issues like criminal records, interactions with the legal system, debt, and tax matters can become big barriers to moving forward. All right, so who's put most at risk? This slide is important because we just don't want you to have any stereotypes, all right? Anyone can be a victim of trafficking. That's what I want you to take away from this. Anyone can be a victim of trafficking. There are certain populations that are more targeted. People who have experienced sexual abuse, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, family violence, sometimes are more at risk. People who are experiencing, different forms of economic instability, whether that's from, institutional racism, whether that's from pervasive poverty in their community, whether that's from prevalent substance abuse, that they're grappling with, say, in their community, their family, people who are grappling with criminal records, people who are part of communities that might have historically or currently be discriminated against. That can all raise the risk that somebody may be exploited. But again, the bottom line is we don't want to stereotype, anyone can be trafficked. And so if we see the signs, if you're working with somebody, we just want you to be prepared to work with people from all across the spectrum of humanity who might need help with these different types of issues. All right, so what are, look how fast I was. We're done. What are the tax issues that we see facing human trafficking survivors? This is a list that, like, we compiled this from the cases that I see every single day and my colleagues see every single day. We see people who have not filed taxes. We're working with them on tons of different other legal issues, and we're like, oh my gosh, I have never filed taxes. What does that mean? And we're like, oh, I don't know. We got to talk to a tax professional. They maybe filed incorrect taxes. They say, you know what, I think this person who was exploiting me, I think they filed taxes on my behalf and they collected some money that I was supposed to be getting, but I'm not sure. And like, how do we figure out what happened and what's going on? You need to consult with a tax professional. We see a lot of people who did not get their stimulus payments, did not get past refunds again, and we have to figure out what happened with that. Individuals who get contacted by here in Maryland, be the Maryland Comptroller or by the IRS, and they don't know what to do. Often feel frozen like deer in headlights because they now have this legal action or this dispute pending against them. We have sometimes people that are facing more complicated criminal actions or have things that are already going down a pipeline of involvement in a tax dispute and they don't know how to resolve it. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our tax professionals to talk a little bit more about identifying these issues and how to help survivors.
Okay, thank you, Heather. So I think one good way to start this discussion off is talking about the different resources that, people have access to that they may not realize they do. So I have 3 different options here on screen. All of them are free. I, of course, as I mentioned, work in the MVLS Low Income Taxpayer Clinics. That's the central column. We are pro bono organizations that represent taxpayers in controversies, which essentially could mean anything from, the IRS takes one position and the client takes another. That counts as a controversy based on any issue. And we can also help file when that filing is required to resolve the controversy. All LITCs, it is a federally funded program, so we have consistent income limit across the country is, you can see it on screen there, and then it goes up for each member of the household, around 11,000 per household member, both people with income and then also dependents as well. There are LITCs in almost every state around the country. I think Nevada and West Virginia might be the 2 that currently don't have any. But there are generally 2 types: academics, LITCs, which work within a university. So example, in Maryland, we also have University of Baltimore and University of Maryland have their own. And then non-academic LITCs like ours that work with volunteers. So in the case that, you find a client who needs to file, but they don't actually have a tax controversy, another organization they might want to reach out for is a volunteer income tax assistance site, or VITA site. So these are sites, and these actually, I do believe there are VITA sites in every state, and there are quite a lot of them. They offer free income tax preparation and filing with volunteers who are IRS certified. They have a higher income limit than our clinic, and they open every year. All of them do in the spring for current year filing. And then importantly, during the rest of the year, many VITA sites also offer back tax preparation. So for previous years, not for all previous years, but for most recent previous years. The important limitation of those is that they cannot represent taxpayers in controversies. If the IRS says there's something wrong with the information that the site filed and the site itself didn't make a mistake, then they can't assist your client in that. Then the last option on the far right is the Taxpayer Advocate Service. So the TAS is part of the IRS, but independently run within the IRS. They can help all taxpayers. It's not income dependent. And you get their help by filing what's called a Form 911. You can guess why it's called that. And that connects you with TAS Advocate. We found that TAS can help with a lot of IRS processes if they don't go correctly. So for example, if there's indication that maybe a refund got lost due to the IRS sending it to the wrong address. TAS would be a good organization to contract. But again, limitation, they cannot represent the taxpayer against the IRS in an appeals process or in tax court, which we will talk about. Now, this map on the right is the Taxpayer Advocate Services roadmap tool. And I know it looks like the most complicated board game or subway system ever designed, but it is essentially an overview of the federal tax system in the United States. And it is, to their credit, color-coded in a way that sort of breaks down into several sections that most people will experience when they file their return, or well, essentially anytime they file their return. So at the beginning, the filing of the return, tax return preparation, that's the dark green section, just filing your taxes and submitting them in a proper fashion. Assessment is where the IRS takes that return and processes it, and either determines that it's correct as far as they know, so they'll make their calculation based on that, or they send it to examination, also sometimes called audit. And that's where they will, sort of look into whether the information is correct, or sometimes contact the taxpayer to help them or get their help in conducting an audit. And if they determine that there is an issue with the return, they will issue a 30-day or a 90-day letter. 90-day letter, which we can talk a little bit about later, is also called a statutory notice of deficiency. So the taxpayer can respond either to the 30-day letter, which will sort of set them on the path of going through the IRS's internal Office of Appeals to plead their case and try to resolve this liability, or they can respond to the 90-day letter by petitioning the U.S. Tax Court. The U.S. Tax Court is sort of a branch of the judiciary. It's not part of the IRS, but it exclusively handles cases between taxpayers and the IRS pretty much. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But one important distinction is that the U.S. Tax Court was created so that there is always a way for the taxpayer to contest a tax liability before having to pay it. In the internal IRS appeal system, you don't always have that guarantee. They might ask you to pay the liability, and then you'll essentially be arguing that you deserve a refund. So if the taxpayer doesn't respond to either, then it gets sent straight to assessment and then collection, which is the process by which the IRS actually tries to compel the taxpayer to pay their tax assessment.
John, I got to tell you, the tax system is an opaque mystery to me. And as I'm sure it is for many of the people participating in this webinar, unless they're tax professionals or attorneys. But I got to say, if you're working with a client that's a visual learner, if sometimes just demystifying a little bit can be really helpful. And I know this chart, we have a tiny little graphic, right? But there is a link to the chart.
Yes,
sometimes it is interesting for people, just it can help manage the fear of engaging with this process and with these issues by just understanding a little bit about the pathway that things take, you know what I mean? Making it a little bit less opaque. So I think this is a really cool thing to share, even if it may be helping remove some roadblocks. So thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say on the website, I remember I wasn't always super satisfied with the explanations, but on the actual tool on the website, you can click on any one of the points in this map, and it will sort of give a short summary of what that point means and what's going on there. So that, I believe, would be quite helpful for people if they're not really sure where they are in the process, because many people are not. So some early considerations when you realize that your client has a tax, or does have a tax controversy. You want to establish kind of from the get-go, is the plan to contest the liability, arguing that they should not owe this money at all, or to seek collection relief? And collection relief is where you essentially are admitting that, the assessment was correct, but for, reasons of fairness in the tax system, or just by reason of them not being able to pay and there are better options, seeking relief from the collections process. The difference is, the reason why you want to determine this early on is contesting the liability requires you to gather financial records of the tax year in question, while getting collection relief usually involves getting current financial records, what people's current financial status is. So their income, their monthly expenses, any assets they have, like a house or a car, because that is used to determine reasonable collection potential, which essentially determines what kind is one of the things that determines what kind of collection relief they can get. Also, again, touching back on tax court has a number of advantages. I've sat in on a number of cases, and I find that they are, as far as courts go, they're very accepting of pro se petitioners, but still pro se representation should be avoided. One of the ways that they're accepting is they try to send people to LITCs before pleading their case pro se. The tax court does have the advantage that it can resolve multiple years of liability in one case. Really all sorts of liabilities and disputes can be settled in one case, and the IRS is willing to settle. It is willing to settle based on issues, not the amount in dispute, which is, I think, a subtle difference that people who are used to working in other areas might not realize at first. If the amount in dispute is very low, that actually really, as opposed to very high, that really wouldn't affect the IRS's negotiation position at all. Because their job is really evaluating what are the chances that the judge is going to rule in our favor in this, because they are not seeking specific amounts of money for the IRS. They're really focused on the issues. Downsides can be kind of significant. The case may call attention to tax issues not yet discovered by the IRS, which can be added to the case in some circumstances if they were not included, and the IRS discovers them early on. There have been cases in our clinic where somebody got a notice of deficiency, but they also told us, this is about 1 year, but I have 6 other years that the IRS has never caught me making this mistake on. And in that case, we decided, it's best for you not to go to tax court because, the judge and the IRS can ask you questions in tax court. And finally, this is, again, something you have to be quite aware of in working with human trafficking survivors. They may just not be comfortable going to court, to speaking in a court setting, standing in front of a judge. And even, as much as I give credit to the tax court, it can be a very intimidating proposal to somebody. So some more early considerations, essentially, things you can do early on to help smooth things out later on. Gathering any notices that the client has received from the federal or state agency regarding what money that they've owed, determining what years they have filed for, and if there are years where they're actually required to file but they haven't yet. You can get what are called tax account transcripts from the IRS. Usually the best way is online. These tax account transcripts will tell you how much money the client owes and for each particular year, which is very important. And then also with tax account transcripts, if the IRS does not have a tax account transcript for a particular year, that actually indicates that the taxpayer did not file for that year and the IRS has not assessed a liability, which is important to know.
John, can I ask a quick question about that, the tax account transcripts? Because I know we've talked about that with some of the clients that we've worked with together. Does that give any notice to the IRS? Like, because I think a lot of the times the clients are leery of, raising their hand and being like, I'm here. I don't know what my status is, or, you know what I mean? What situation I'm in terms of tax liability, or so when you're asking for these transcripts, is there any risk that it could send a flag up to the IRS, or is it really just kind of getting any information the IRS may have from you?
In our experience, IRS systems are opaque, so I can't say it's impossible, but in our experience, generally not. That generally is not enough of a consideration to outweigh, getting this information that you really need. Because, if you don't request the transcript, then the IRS has information that you don't. And that is just not a good, really position to be in when you're worried about a tax controversy or a liability. And then also, if, for example, if somebody has no way of knowing what was reported to the IRS, using this same link, you can actually request wage and income transcripts for the last 10 years. And those will report what the IRS has received regarding the taxpayer's income, which is, of course, not always correct, but it's what it's what was reported to the IRS.
I mean, to me, that seems like just such a great way to identify if there is fraud, if there was, you know what I mean, kind of a bad actor, you know what I mean, or traffic or taking advantage.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
this is really helpful. Thank you.
In terms of contacting the state taxing authority, every state is different. In Maryland, they are kind enough to give us just an actual email address that people can email. And they don't provide transcripts, but they will tell you over email what years that they owe for, and how much they owe for each year. Also, if you have any tax returns, make sure you check them for any errors. Pull a credit report to determine if there are any debts that you might not have known about, or if there's an identity theft issue. That will also help you identify it. Search public tax records for any recorded liens. Taxpayers should get a notice about those, but a lot of the times, they don't for some reason. And then also, which I believe we're going to hear a little bit more about from Candice, tax issues can be very time sensitive.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm excited to be here today as well. If you're unfamiliar with the tax process, there are some important dates that you should keep in mind. So one of those are the assessment statute, and that's what gives the IRS 3 years from the date the return was due or filed, whichever is later, to assess. And this is important because the IRS has to make an assessment in order to collect. The second is an appeal of a determination. And so earlier when John was explaining going through an audit and then they issue a 30-day letter, so you have 30 days to respond. And then if you don't respond, you also have the 90-day letter and responding to the 90-day letter. And if you don't respond, then you lose your right to go to U.S. tax court, which John also touched on. Notably for the 90-day letter, if you do miss that 90-day window, you can pay the tax, request a refund from the IRS, and then you could sue the IRS for a refund in U.S. District Court or the Court of Federal Claims. And then you have the collection statute, which is the IRS's ability to collect from you. So you have 10 years from the date of assessment to collect a tax liability. And I'll touch on a little bit after this, things that might affect that. And then you have your refund statute, which sometimes gets missed and also changes if you take different actions on a taxpayer's account. But generally, a taxpayer must file a claim for a refund within 3 years from the date the original return was filed, or 2 years from the date that the tax was paid, whichever is later. Importantly for that, if you do file a claim and it's after that 3-year period, but it's within the 2-year period, then that refund won't exceed the tax that was paid within the 2 years.
And just thinking about these timing considerations, like, because so many of the individuals that we're working with, like, again, it's kind of years later. So the clock begins running on a lot of those, like, kind of once they take action, right? It seems like.
So I would recommend in general, anytime that you're coming into a tax case, you should inquire on what these dates are from the beginning.
Okay.
So if you call in, you can ask for the CSAD for each year, which is that collection statute expiration date. And then I would also recommend that you double check that it's correct. You look for codes on the account transcript. There's also a manual that tells you what those codes mean on an account transcript. And you look for different events that toll that collection statute. Because there's actions that you can take that will stop that clock from running. And in that vein, on this slide, those are things you should keep in mind when you're trying to come up with a case strategy. So for example, if you have a client who has a year or two left on a large liability, it might make sense to try to wait instead of taking certain actions like requesting an installment agreement or an offer in compromise, particularly an offer in compromise, because they can take quite a while to get processed. Because while that request is pending, that clock isn't running down anymore. And so that 2 years stops running, and it might be worth just waiting the 2 years out, because after that, the IRS can't collect anymore on that year. And then for the assessment statute, particularly for HT clients, if a return wasn't filed and it was required to be, or if there's a fraudulent return, then that the assessment statute doesn't run. The IRS has unlimited time to assess, and that's something else to keep in mind. So when you were, talking earlier about whether or not somebody should pull an account transcript, does that trigger something? I think absolutely it's important to inquire on your account, because if you were required to file a return and you didn't, they don't have a time limit to assess, so it's important to make sure that you are staying on top of those tax obligations. I think we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, so I think it's questions about accessing information for accessibility. Would it be possible to receive a transcript? Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually asking about a transcript of the presentation today, and I can follow up with you privately on that. Thank you. We should hopefully be able to download a transcript. Thanks.
Sorry about that. And so aside from timing considerations, there are also other special considerations that you should keep in mind, particularly when there are unfiled returns, or there are returns that need to be amended, or there's fraud that's suspected. Income that's earned from illegal sources must be reported. The Fifth Amendment does allow taxpayers to report income from illegal sources without actually disclosing the source. Filing an amended return does not negate fraud on the original filing. However, it can show good faith and it can prevent fraud penalties. And then if a taxpayer did not authorize a return, if you have a client who doesn't recognize a return, or they don't recognize some item that's on the return, then you can discuss identity theft and return preparer fraud relief options with them. It's important to note for that sometimes HT clients may not want to go down that route, because it requires you to disclose information about the individual or individuals who may have filed that return on your behalf. And that might not be something that they want to do. But in any case, if you're unsure on what steps to take, and these are the situations you're facing, it might be worth consulting a criminal tax controversy attorney to make sure that you're not leaving off income, or filing an amended return that may be fraudulent. Any of those considerations, you should address that with a client and take careful consideration of it.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me chiming in, I would like to specify that low income taxpayer clinics, we are actually prohibited in our program's grant requirements from taking any criminal tax cases. MVLS, I don't think we would be able to anyway, because we only deal with civil matters. But that also will go for pretty much all of the LITCs in the country. I will say that it might still be worth reaching out to them to see if they have volunteers who might be able to help just on their own. Because of course, if somebody's volunteering at an LITC, it shows that they might be able to help in this other situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if things were getting so severe where there's fraud, there's, you know what I mean, there's these complicated tax considerations that are getting into a criminal tax controversy, I believe that we could likely leverage one of our volunteers, or be able to hopefully find someone through our connections with the State Bar Association. And that goes for anyone that's outside Maryland too. The LITCs, they're here to help folks, and they will have connections in the legal community, hopefully, that they can reach out and help find some assistance as well. So it shouldn't be a roadblock to trying to address these issues. It can seem like increasingly complicated, but there are people that can help. So, like Candice.
So we're going to transition into collection, which is a little bit different than what we were just talking about. The IRS has numerous ways that they try to collect. One is federal tax lien. That arises when the IRS makes an assessment, then issues a notice, and then a demand for payment. They'll often file a notice of federal tax lien to let other creditors know that they're first in time, first in right to collect. Then they'll levy. That's just seizure of a taxpayer's property or their right to property. So they can garnish your wages, they can take money from your account, they can sell your vehicles, your real estate, other personal property you have. It's very important that if you're getting a notice that says that the IRS is going to take collection action and it's saying that they're going to file a lien or they have filed a lien or they're going to levy, that you contact them or you contact an attorney, maybe a low income taxpayer clinic, to address it right away so that you don't let it sit, because you don't want them to reach into your bank account and take your money. And then the last, which is often forgot about, is that the IRS can suspend or revoke a taxpayer's passport. And that also happens. And sometimes it can happen at the most inconvenient time if you're trying to leave the country or if you need it for whatever reason. So some of the ways that you can address your collection is through current non-collectible status, which shorthand is CNC, an installment agreement, or an offer in compromise. And so for CNC, that's for taxpayers who cannot afford to pay their tax liability. And so temporarily they defer paying. It's important to note that for CNC, the tax liability it still exists and interest and penalties are still accruing. This is often used if somebody does have a CSED that is coming up, in a year or so, and they are unable to pay. Instead of filing for maybe an offer to settle the liability for less and having that collection statute stop running, you might try to do a CNC and let that collection statute run out. That is something the IRS allows when you call in to do CNC. So it's something that might be an option for a taxpayer, but it is temporary. The IRS might file a lien still to issue their right to your assets so that other creditors can't come after something that you may owe them in the meantime. And then an installment agreement, that's for somebody who wants to be able to pay and can pay over an extended period. There are some simple installment agreements, and then there are some more complicated ones. If it's something that the IRS will accept because it's a larger amount monthly, it can be as simple as filling out one form and they take it right out of your bank account. And then if it's a less amount and it's based on your income, they might have you submit a financial form and attach documents proving that that's all you can pay. And then the last is an offer in compromise. And that one I would say is utilized quite a bit for people who have large tax liabilities. And there's a lot of flexibility with offers. So if you missed your time to appeal a determination by exam, or you missed your time to petition U.S. tax court, and you don't want to go to the U.S. District Court or Court of Federal Claims, but you don't believe that you owe the liability, then you can use a doubt as to liability offer, and you can make the argument that you don't believe you owe the underlying tax. So you explain why, and you attach proof as to why you don't owe it. The second is a doubt as to collectability, and that's for somebody who is facing an economic hardship. Essentially, it's somebody who just can't afford to pay based on their assets and their income and what they owe. The IRS makes a determination that they can only afford to pay a certain amount. And whatever that amount is, the IRS will settle the full amount for that amount. And then effective tax administration is one that I would say people can use for, particularly for HT clients, because it takes into consideration factors of equity. So if there's wrongful acts by a third party, if there are other factors that create economic hardship. I will say though, for ETA, you can't also qualify for doubt as to collectability. So if you have a client who's unable to pay, then doubt as to collectability is going to be your first stop. But if they can afford to pay and paying would create an economic hardship and there's other factors of equity, then that is going to be your route to go. So for example, if you have a client who was trafficked and then they have a large liability, but it's not because of the trafficking, maybe they're, having trouble getting back on their feet. And so they didn't file for a year or two, or they filed, but they did it incorrectly. And then they had to go back and amend, and it resulted in penalties that then sat for 3 or 4 years, and they owe $40,000, $50,000 or whatever it may be. That might be a good option if now, based on their income, they can afford to pay. They have a house and they make a decent amount of money. However, say that their house is, their mortgage is less than what rent would be. and that's their only asset. You know, it might not be worth them selling their house to then have to go rent, you know, to be able to pay that liability. It's things like that the IRS will consider, but because they would be able to pay, you might not do an offer doubt as to collectability. You might submit an offer effective tax administration and then include the factors dealing with their previous history with trafficking and how they were struggling to get back on their feet, the progress they've made, and these other considerations dealing with economic hardship.
Candice, this seems like, I mean, this is it sounds like it's a great option in a way if a survivor kind of wants to share their story. I mean, I know that's also sometimes a fraught decision and they might want to be working with case manager, other support networks to make that, that decision, talking to their attorney. But it does sound like there is a chance through some of these different offer and compromise options for the survivor to kind of explain what happened, how it's impacted them, and then ask for relief.
It is an option for sure. I would say that sometimes the IRS is less willing to settle based on equity, as they, they're more skewed toward numbers. And so if you have doubt as collectability, it's a lot more straightforward.
Okay.
But they will also consider ETA arguments. I think the most important factor is showing that economic hardship and that it's and what has caused it. And it does give you a forum to explain your history. So that's an option. It's important though to point out for offers that you do have to be in filing compliance. So that means that you have to have filed the last 6 years of your returns if you were required to file. And then going forward, you also need to stay in compliance. So it's really important when you're working with any HT client, any client in general, that you're counseling them on how to stay in compliance moving forward, meaning they're filing their returns on time, they're paying on time. And that's something that you should be discussing with them from the beginning, not just, what happened in the past, but also how can we fix it going forward? Or is there something that needs to be fixed moving forward so that when they're done, with you and you've resolved the issue, that they don't wind up back in front of you with the same or similar issue again. Another option, which sometimes is underutilized, is penalty abatement. So if you have somebody who has enormous penalties because something's been sitting for a while, you can try to utilize penalty abatement. There's two types. One is first-time penalty abatement and the other is reasonable cause. So I'll start with first time just because it's a lot more simple. First-time penalty abatement is for exactly what it says, people who haven't used it before. It's generally based on your compliance history. You can call in and you can ask, you can say, hey, am I eligible for first-time penalty abatement? I know there's been a push recently for it to just happen automatic. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the IRS will, instead of using reasonable cause, they will just do first-time penalty abatement, which is kind of a hit or miss situation for somebody because maybe they would rather use their reasonable cause if they have a good cause instead of using their one-time first-time penalty abatement to abate their penalties. And for anybody that doesn't know what that means, essentially just means IRS is going to waive the penalties that a taxpayer owes. And so say that you owe $10,000 in total and 3,000 of that is a penalty and 2 is interest and then 5 is tax. They might waive the 3 of penalties and that leaves you with, not even 7, it leaves you with 5, because notably, if they're waiving the penalties, they'll also reduce or remove the related interest for those penalties. So it's a really great way to sort of reduce that overall tax liability that somebody might have with the IRS. Now, one that's more narrowed toward HT clients is the reasonable cause penalty abatement. So what the taxpayer would demonstrate is that they exercised ordinary care and prudence and were nevertheless unable to file their return or deposit or pay the tax due. That standard's for everybody for reasonable cause. However, examples that are specific to trafficking survivors would be unavoidable absence of the taxpayer. The taxpayer was unable to determine the amount of tax due for reasons that were beyond their control, or lack of funds. There are several examples that are given in the Internal Revenue Manual that you can look to. So if you're somebody who's unfamiliar with the tax field and you don't really know where to start, the IRS has the Internal Revenue Manual, which is available online for everybody to see. And it's their internal guide that tells their employees what they have to do or what they should do. It's not binding on us. We can't say, hey, the Internal Revenue Manual says you have to do this, but it's really useful when you're coming up with a case strategy and when you want to know what kind of things they're going to consider when you're submitting something to them. So it's great to give insight on what the internal processes are within the IRS. And these 3 examples are some of the ones that are cited within the Internal Revenue Manual that would be applicable for HT clients. All right, and so we're going to transition into a case example that I had, and this is actually from my time in clinic. This was one of my very first clients as a student attorney. So the client came to us for help with a longstanding Maryland liability that arose as a result of her being trafficked. She had a return that she didn't authorize that was filed on her behalf, and the return reflected a refund. And she didn't have a filing requirement for that period. She resolved the issue with the IRS several years, but she could not resolve her liability with Maryland. So when she came to us, she didn't have a federal liability anymore, but she had a liability with Maryland. Maryland had put a hold on her license, and they also were offsetting her tax refund each year when she was filing. So she was in a pretty messed up situation, as you can imagine. So what things did we consider here? Well, typically when you see somebody filed a return on your behalf, immediately you're thinking fraud. But in this situation, she had already addressed it with the IRS. So the real issue is how do we get this information to Maryland so Maryland can also reflect that change? So the first step is, pulling transcripts from the IRS to see if we can get some information about what happened with the history of the account, which that's fairly simple to do. The more difficult part was getting something from the IRS that explained what happened. We tried to contact them and explain, hey, our taxpayer has this liability reflected on this year. You don't have the liability reflected, and we want to provide to the state what happened so that they can also make a change. It would help if you could help us out. And we kept getting a response from them that would say, we don't understand what you're asking for because there's no liability. And we kept responding, explaining, this is what we're asking for and this is why. But eventually we were able to get something that said there was no liability and this is what happened. And then after that, it was a matter of finding the right person to get in contact with Maryland, which Maryland's usually pretty simple. You can call in or you can submit documents through the email to be able to reach the correct person. And if the process isn't working properly, it's also easy to find somebody who can help. So once we were able to get that from the IRS, we were able to submit that to Maryland, and Maryland was able to fix the liability. It is important to note, though, again, when you have issues like this, particularly with the IRS, this is one of those situations where you would want to keep an eye on your refund statute, because if it's been years that have passed, even if you're able to go back and fix what caused the liability or remove the liability from the account, if offsets have happened year after year, sometimes it might be difficult to recapture or get any of that money back that the taxpayer has paid. So the quicker you're able to address the liability, the more likely you'll be to be able to maybe recapture some of that money that the taxpayer might have incorrectly paid. And then another example is a client who came to us for help with a large federal tax liability. The liability didn't arise from being trafficked. This is similar to the example I was giving earlier about an offer in compromise, but the client was struggling to get back on their feet. And as a result, they didn't file for several years. So this is a matter of looking to see what returns need to be filed. Luckily here, there weren't considerations of whether or not there was fraud. There weren't considerations of income that was from an illegal source. So that wasn't something that we had to counsel on. And then after getting those returns filed correctly, we were able to just get her into an installment agreement. It wasn't an offer and compromise situation. We did inquire as to penalty abatement. So there's considerations there for you to also think maybe you can get some penalty abatement relief. But when you're working through any of these matters, if you're an attorney who's charging money, if it's not pro bono, depending on what the situation is, that's something you want to consider. And then also the likelihood of something being accepted by the IRS, because if it's not, and it's been a year that's passed or 2 years that you're fighting to get something approved, that's 2 years of interest, right? That's making that liability kind of snowball. So you want to keep that in mind, that even if it's something that you could fight and you want to throw everything at the wall for a client, it might not be the best strategy to throw everything at the wall if in 2 years none of the things stick that you threw at the wall. and the liabilities doubled because you let it sit. So keep that in mind when you're working through some of these, these issues. And I believe that I'm going to hand this back over to, is it John? It's going back to John to talk about some of the Maryland stuff.
Yes, yes. And I know we're coming up on the 5-minute mark, so I'll try to keep this short. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Maryland state liabilities and state tax liabilities in general. States often have collection powers that the IRS doesn't. So at least in Maryland, Maryland actually has the ability to place a hold on the taxpayer's driver's license, professional license, and the registration, preventing them from renewing any of these things if they don't pay an unaddressed tax liability. They will release this when the taxpayer enters into a payment plan or their version of currently not collectible. But it's still something that very often sends clients to us, is them realizing that they can't renew the driver's license. Also, a little bit of a variation, Maryland does accept OICs, but there are a couple of additional rules, one of which is they only consider them 2 years after the taxpayer has become liable, not just when the return is due, and after all other options of administrative appeal have been exhausted, and they don't let you appeal denials. So I think if you're practicing in Maryland, that's something to be aware of. And also, if you're not practicing in Maryland, just a reminder that you really should, do some research about the state tax authorities' rules and regulations, because they often will differ from the IRS in pretty unique and important ways. And a lot of times taxpayers, if they have a federal tax liability, they very often have a state tax liability at the same time. And a lot of times they have trouble differentiating them. I have a lot of clients who will say they owe the IRS, and then they send me a document and it's from the Maryland comptroller. So that is something very quickly to say practitioners should be aware of.
So my big takeaways from this, and I realize we are winding down in our hour. Thank you so much to both of you. My big takeaways from this are, there are some questions you can ask, which were up on a slide in the beginning of this presentation, to kind of assess if someone may have a tax controversy issue. If that individual, if that trafficking survivor does, we don't want to ignore it. You want to be connecting with an LITC, with another tax professional in your state. If you're in Maryland, you can definitely reach out to MVLS. I would encourage you to come through our partnership with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, where you'll be screened for the legal issues, a comprehensive screening for any civil legal issues the client might have. And then we will connect you to John and his program and get you the tax help that you need, that the individual needs for their particular challenge. But we don't want to ignore it. There are means that advocates can help survivors with for kind of assessing if they do have any kind of liability issue, for understanding if taxes have been filed, for getting access to records for past years. So we will be compiling all this information in an updated tip sheet that will be going on our website, along with the webinar recording and the slides. We are here as resources. I'm not going to go over this last slide. This is just another great remedy that came out on the federal level. It's called the Debt Bondage Repair Act. I mentioned it and threw it in here because it's a way that we have actually been identifying tax controversies for some of our trafficking survivors that we are working with at MVLS, and we provide assistance. This is a way of improving your credit score and credit reports by removing negative information that might be associated with the trafficking experience. But basically, there are people out here that can help. This is a convoluted, tough process. It's a tough legal issue to address for survivors, but we don't want to just leave it lingering, because as John said, as Candice said, it can come back. Wages can be garnished. Driver's licenses can be put on hold, and we don't want those things to be affecting survivors as they're trying to move forward with their lives. So, so we hope this was informative. We realize this was just kind of dipping our toes into this vast issue. If you are a tax practitioner, please, 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 especially in Maryland, reach out to John if you're interested in volunteering. We thank Candice so much for joining us today, and for bringing your expertise and your case experience. And it's so great to know that, you know, you're part of our MVLS community and here is a resource in Maryland with any of these tax cases. John, I know you wanted to say a few words about volunteering with the LATC.
Yes, just a few things. So I really wanted to ask, you know, everybody in this call, if there's any interest at all, please seriously consider signing up to volunteer with MVLS. If not with me, maybe another one of our many programs. We always need more volunteers. You know, we always have people coming to us for help. Even with clients where, you know, they owe $2,000 to the state and they just can't pay it, and you know the driver's license is getting old. Even though we might think it's a small amount of money, it means the world to them. So, you know, please do consider signing up. If you're not super familiar with tax law, you know, it's okay. You know, we hold trainings, we offer mentorships, and obviously you can always come to us to ask questions. And of course, as you can see, our pro bono portal lets you select cases that you have interest in. So yeah, please do consider volunteering. We really appreciate it.
And we have a very comprehensive website. Both MVLS's website has just an amazing plethora of trainings on all sorts of civil legal issues that we handle through our program, including a lot of resources on tax matters. We also have a great website at our partner organization, the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which is htprevention.org, which links to our Maryland, our MVLS resource library for the HTPP partnership, where we have over 5 years now of webinars, tip sheets, and other resources that can help you dive deeper into all of these different legal issues. I think if we go to our last slide, we also encourage you to follow us on social media, but then you can also reach out to us directly if you have any questions. There is our contact information. And we are so timely. It is 1:02. We dive deep into the subject. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. And we really appreciate you being here with us today. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly. See, there's a question that's been coming up about receiving a certificate for this training. We do not offer, we do not have CLEs here in Maryland, so we do not offer any particular certificate for this training. If you need some kind of confirmation, you can reach out to me directly and I can confirm that you took part in the webinar. Thank you so much.
And I'm just leaving the webinar running for a couple of minutes so people have a chance to log out and take our survey.
Yes, there should be an exit survey popping up as you log out. We would encourage you to take a moment and fill that out. We appreciate the feedback. And there should also be a field if there's any other topics that you would be interested in hearing about on future Third Thursday, LATC, or HTPP webinars. Please let us know. Thank you.